Lyra's hands were shaking before she even reached the ceremony platform, but she forced them still. The whole pack had gathered in the clearing outside the great hall, torches burning against the cold night air, and every eye in that crowd was fixed on the raised stone platform where Chaol stood waiting. Lyra had imagined this moment 1,000 times since she was a girl. She had imagined Chaol turning to her, calling her name, taking her hand in front of everyone who had ever doubted that a quiet Omega like her could matter to an Alpha like him. She had never imagined this. Chaol stood tall in his ceremonial coat, the silver clasp at his throat catching the torchlight, and beside him stood Serena, a noblewoman from the Eastern Pax, her chin lifted in triumph. The elder holding the ceremony scroll cleared his throat and read the names aloud, and when he reached the final line, the line that was supposed to end with Lyra's name, he said Serena's instead. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Lyra felt her friend Grace grip her arm from behind, felt the collective breath the pack seemed to hold as they waited to see how she would react. Everyone knew. Everyone had always known that Lyra loved Chaol, had loved him since they were children racing through the training yards together, since he pulled her out of the river when she was 11 and told her she was the bravest person he knew. Chaol did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward, on Serena, on the scroll, on anything but Lyra standing at the edge of the crowd in her simple gray dress, while Serena wore silk the color of dawn. The elder called for the mating vow to begin, and Chaol took Serena's hand. Lyra smiled. It was not the reaction anyone expected. Grace's fingers tightened on her arm, a silent question. A few pack members turned to stare at her, waiting for tears, for a scene, for anything that would confirm the story they had already written in their minds about the Omega girl who loved an Alpha who would never choose her. Instead, Lyra stood with her spine straight and her smile calm and unreadable, and something about that calm unsettled the crowd more than any tears could have, because Lyra knew something none of them did. 3 weeks earlier, on a gray morning when the Blackthorn Pack's northern border had been threatened by wolves from a neighboring territory, Lyra had been sent with a small group to deliver supplies to the border patrol. It was routine work, the kind of task given to Omegas who were trusted but never truly valued, and Lyra had gone without complaint, the way she always did. She had not expected to encounter anyone of importance. She certainly had not expected to encounter the Alpha King of all packs. Draven rarely left the Crown territory. He was a figure spoken of in stories more than seen in person, a king so composed and unreadable that lesser Alphas trembled at the thought of standing before him. When Lyra's small group crossed paths with his traveling party at the border, checking on a dispute between territories, she had kept her head down and done her work, expecting nothing more than to deliver crates and leave. But Draven had looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. He approached her directly, ignoring the startled bows of his own guards, and asked her name in a voice that was quiet, but carried the weight of command anyway. Lyra had given it, confused and a little afraid, certain she had done something wrong. Instead, Draven had gone very still, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she did not understand. "It's you," he had said, so softly that only she heard it. She learned, in the conversation that followed, careful and quiet and away from the ears of both their parties, what those words meant. Draven had spent years without a mate, refusing every match his advisors arranged, insisting he would know his fated bond when he found it. He had begun to believe he never would. And then, on an ordinary morning at a border checkpoint, he had found it standing in front of him in a simple gray dress with dirt on her hands from carrying crates. Lyra had not told anyone. Not Grace, not her family, not a single soul in the Blackthorn Pack. Part of her had been afraid to believe it was real, afraid that a king's sudden interest would vanish as quickly as it appeared. Part of her had wanted, selfishly, to keep it as something entirely her own, untouched by the pack's opinions and expectations, for just a little while longer. And part of her, if she was honest with herself, had wanted to see what Chaol would do. She had told herself it wasn't a test. She had told herself she still hoped, foolishly, that Chaol would choose her the way she had always dreamed. But some quiet, honest part of her heart had already known the answer before the ceremony even began, had known it in the way Chaol's eyes softened only for Serena in recent months, had known it in the careful distance he kept from Lyra at pack gatherings. Now, standing in the crowd and watching him bind himself to another woman, Lyra understood that the last piece of her old life was ending, and instead of grief, what rose in her chest was something closer to relief. The ceremony concluded. The pack cheered. Kale and Serena descended the platform together, and as they passed through the crowd receiving congratulations, Kale's eyes finally found Lyra's. He faltered. It was brief, barely a flicker, but Lyra saw it. She saw the confusion in his expression when he registered her calm face, her steady posture, the absence of the heartbreak he had clearly braced himself to witness. For a moment his steps slowed, as though he meant to say something to her, some quiet apology meant only for her ears. Serena's hand tightened on his arm, and the moment passed. He was pulled forward into the celebration, and Lyra watched him go without a single flicker of the pain she had expected to feel. Grace pulled her aside as the crowd dispersed toward the feast tables. "What is wrong with you?" she whispered, her eyes wide with worry. "You should be devastated. I was ready to hold you all night. Why are you smiling like that?" Lyra looked at her friend, at the genuine concern etched into her face, and felt a wave of affection for her. "I'm fine," she said. "I promise you, Grace, I am better than fine." Grace did not look convinced, but she let it go, the way good friends sometimes do when they sense there is more to a story than they are being told yet. The feast stretched long into the night, full of music and dancing, and the particular loud joy that came after a mating ceremony. Lyra stayed only long enough to be polite, offering brief congratulations to Kale and Serena from a respectful distance, her smile never wavering, even when Serena's gaze lingered on her a beat too long, sharp and assessing, as though she sensed something Lyra wasn't saying. When Lyra finally slipped away from the hall into the cool night air, she found herself walking toward the edge of the Packlands, toward the same border where everything had changed 3 weeks earlier. She stood beneath the tree line, looking north toward the Crown territory, and let herself, for the first time all evening, feel the full weight of what was happening. Tomorrow she would leave. She had already spoken with the Pax Beta about family business, requiring her to travel. A vague explanation that raised no real questions, because no one expected an Omega like Lyra to have anywhere important to go. She had packed a small bag 2 nights ago and hidden it beneath her bed. She had told no one the truth, not even Grace, because the truth still felt too fragile to speak aloud, too impossible to risk exposing to doubt before it had fully become real. A fated mate. A king, her. It should have felt like a fairy tale, and in some ways it did, but standing alone in the dark, with the sounds of Kale's celebration still drifting faintly through the trees behind her, Lyra mostly felt something quieter and steadier than excitement. She felt like a door was opening onto a life she had never imagined for herself, one where she was not the overlooked Omega who loved an Alpha who never truly saw her, but something else entirely. She thought of Draven's face in that quiet conversation at the border, the careful, almost disbelieving way he had looked at her, as though she were something precious he had stopped hoping to find. She thought of the letter that had arrived 4 days ago, delivered by a rider in Crown colors, who had pressed it into her hands with instructions to read it alone. She had read it so many times the parchment had begun to soften at the folds. "Come to the Crown territory when you are ready," he had written. "I will not rush you, and I will not ask you to explain yourself to anyone before you are prepared to. But know that I have not stopped thinking of you since the moment I learned your name, and I do not intend to stop." Lyra pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heart beating steady and sure beneath her palm, and made her decision fully, completely, for the last time. Tomorrow she would leave Blackthorn Pack behind. Tomorrow she would go and claim the life that was waiting for her. Behind her, faintly, she heard someone approaching through the trees, footsteps too light and hesitant to belong to a search party sent by the feast. She turned and found Kale standing several paces away, his ceremonial coat replaced by a plain shirt, his expression uncertain in a way she had rarely seen from him. "I saw you leave the hall," he said. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." For a long moment Lyra only looked at him, this boy who had pulled her from the river when she was 11, who had grown into a man who could not quite bring himself to choose her, who even now, on the night of his own mating ceremony, could not resist checking on her welfare, as though some old habit refused to die. She felt none of the anger she might have expected, none of the grief, only a distant, gentle sort of closure, the kind that comes when a chapter ends cleanly instead of bitterly. "I'm all right, Kale," she said, and meant it. Truly. Go back to your mate. This is your night. He hesitated, searching her face as though looking for the cracks he expected to find. Some sign of the heartbreak he had clearly braced himself for when he saw her walking away from the hall. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it, and something in his expression shifted into confusion. "You're really all right?" he said slowly, as though testing the words. "I really am," she said, and smiled again. The same calm, unreadable smile she had worn on the platform. "Good night, Cale." She walked past him, back toward the pack houses, leaving him standing alone at the edge of the trees, with a question in his eyes he clearly did not know how to ask. She did not look back. There was no need to. Whatever they had once been to each other belonged to a version of her life that was already ending, already becoming a story she would look back on someday with distance instead of pain. Tomorrow, everything would change. She just had no idea, not yet, how much. The road north was longer than Lyra remembered from her single journey to the border, and every mile felt like shedding another layer of the life she was leaving behind. She had left before sunrise, slipping out of the pack house with her small bag, while the rest of Blackthorn still slept off the celebration from the night before. She left a short note for Grace, promising to explain everything soon, and nothing at all for anyone else. By the time the sun cleared the trees, she was already miles from the only home she had ever known, walking a path that grew wider and better kept the closer she came to Crown Lands. She had traveled perhaps 2 hours when she heard hoofbeats behind her, fast and purposeful, and turned to see a small escort of riders in the deep blue colors of the crown approaching. At their head rode a woman with sharp eyes and a posture that suggested years of military discipline, who slowed her horse beside Lyra and studied her with open curiosity. "You're the one the king has been asking about," the woman said. It was not quite a question. Lyra felt her pulse quicken. "I'm Lyra," she said carefully. The woman's expression eased into something warmer. "I'm Amelia, captain of the king's personal guard. He sent us 3 days ago with instructions to watch this road until you appeared. He said you might try to walk the entire way yourself out of stubbornness." Despite herself, Lyra laughed, a real laugh, the first one in what felt like weeks. That does sound like something he would guess correctly. Amelia dismounted and offered Lyra a horse from the small train they had brought, and the rest of the journey passed far more quickly than the first stretch had. Amelia proved to be easy company, sharp-witted and direct, filling the miles with stories about life in the Crown territory, and gentle, curious questions about Lyra's life in Blackthorn that Lyra answered honestly, grateful for the distraction from her own nervousness. "Is he really as serious as everyone says?" Lyra asked at one point, watching the road curve ahead of them through hills she had never seen before. Amelia considered the question. "Serious, yes," she said. "But not cold, whatever the stories claim. He is careful with people, because he has had to be. A king who lets his guard down too easily does not stay king for long, but with the people he trusts, he is different." "And how do you know he trusts me?" Lyra asked. Amelia glanced at her sideways, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "Because he sent his entire personal guard to watch a dirt road for 3 days on the chance you might appear on it," she said. "That is not something he has done for anyone else in the years I have served him." The Crown territory announced itself gradually, first in the widening of the road, then in the increasing number of travelers and merchants moving along it, then finally in the sight of the capital itself, rising ahead of them, walls of pale stone catching the afternoon light, banners in deep blue snapping in the wind above the gates. Lyra had never seen anything like it. Blackthorn's territory was rural and modest, its buildings simple and practical. The Crown capital looked like something out of the old stories her mother used to tell her as a child. Grand and layered, and alive with more people than Lyra had ever seen gathered in one place. They passed through the gates without ceremony, Amelia's guard colors enough to wave them through, and made their way up through the city toward the palace at its center. Lyra felt increasingly out of place with every street they crossed, painfully aware of her simple traveling clothes among the finely dressed nobility moving through the capital's streets, aware of the dust on her boots and the plainness of her bag compared to the elegant carriages passing by. By the time they reached the palace gates, her earlier confidence had thinned considerably, replaced by a nervous flutter she could not quite settle. Amelia seemed to notice. "Breathe," she said quietly as they dismounted in the palace courtyard. Whatever you're picturing in your head right now, it is not going to be as bad as that." Before Lyra could respond, a door across the courtyard opened, and Draven stepped out. He looked different than she remembered from their brief meeting at the border, dressed now in clothes befitting his station, rather than the practical traveling gear he had worn that day. His dark hair neater, his bearing even more commanding. But his eyes, when they found her across the courtyard, held the exact same expression she remembered, that same startled, almost disbelieving warmth, as though he still could not quite trust that she was real. He crossed the courtyard toward her at a pace just controlled enough to avoid looking like he was hurrying, though Lyra suspected he wanted to. When he reached her, he stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to leave her room, and something about that careful restraint eased the last of her nervousness more than any grand gesture could have. "You came," he said. "I did," she said. "I wasn't certain you would," he admitted. "I know I asked a great deal of you. To leave your home, your pack, everything you knew, based on a handful of minutes at a border checkpoint and a letter from a stranger." Lyra considered her words carefully. "You weren't entirely a stranger," she said finally. "Even in those few minutes, I knew something about you that mattered more than how long we'd spoken." "What was that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "That you were honest with me," she said. "You could have said nothing. You could have let me walk away and never thought of it again, and no one would have known any different. Instead, you told me the truth, even though it must have been strange and difficult to say out loud to someone you'd just met. That mattered to me. It still does." Something shifted in Draven's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look, for just a moment, less like the composed king of every story, and more like an ordinary man standing nervously in front of someone he cared about. "Then I am glad I told you the truth," he said, and offered his arm. "Come. Let me show you where you'll be staying, and then we can talk properly, without an audience of guards pretending not to listen." Amelia, still nearby, made a small sound of protest at being called an eavesdropper, and Draven's mouth curved into the first real smile Lyra had seen from him, quick and a little crooked, gone as fast as it appeared, but leaving a warmth behind it that made her chest feel lighter than it had in days. They walked together into the palace, and as the grand doors closed behind them, Lyra felt the last threads connecting her to her old life settle quietly into place, not broken, exactly, but folded away, ready to become memory instead of present. Ahead of her stretched something entirely new, uncertain in its details but steady in its foundation, built on a truth she had chosen to trust from the very first moment she heard it. She did not yet know how much would be asked of her in the months ahead, how much she would need to learn, how many people would resist the idea of an ordinary Omega from a minor pack standing beside their king. She did not know about the whispers already beginning to spread through the packs about the king's mysterious new mate, or the suspicion that would soon take root in Serena's sharp, calculating mind back in Blackthorn. For now, walking beside Draven through halls lined with tall windows and soft afternoon light, she only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was walking toward something instead of away from it. The council chamber went silent the moment Draven led Lyra through its heavy doors, and every head at the long table turned to stare. She had known this moment was coming. Draven had warned her the night before, gently but honestly, that introducing her to his council would not be simple, that many of the men and women who advised him had spent years hoping he would choose a mate from one of the great noble houses, someone with political weight and old family alliances behind her name. An Omega from a minor pack, arriving with nothing but a small travel bag and no title to her name, was not what any of them had expected or wanted. Still, nothing could have fully prepared her for the weight of that silence, or for the open skepticism on several faces around the table. "This is Lyra," Draven said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, leaving no room for argument in his tone even though his words were simple. "My fated mate. She will be treated with the same respect owed to any member of this court, and I expect that respect to be shown starting now." An older man near the head of the table, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, cleared his throat carefully. "My king," he said, "with respect, we understand the significance of a fated bond, but surely you can appreciate the concerns some of us hold. The stability of the crown depends on alliances, on—" "I am aware of what stability depends on, Edward," Draven interrupted, his tone still even but noticeably cooler. "I have spent a decade building it. I do not intend to abandon careful judgment now. But a fated bond is not something I can simply set aside for the sake of political convenience, and I would not want to, even if I could. Edward inclined his head, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press further in front of the full council. Around the table, other reactions varied. A younger woman near the far end offered Lyra a small, curious smile, while a stern-faced man beside Edward simply studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between assessment and doubt. The meeting that followed covered territory business Lyra only partially understood, matters of trade agreements between packs and a dispute over hunting grounds near the western border. She sat quietly beside Draven, listening more than speaking, absorbing the rhythms of how his court functioned, the careful balance of deference and disagreement that seemed to define every exchange around that table. It was nothing like the informal, familiar gatherings of Blackthorn's pack meetings, and she found herself grateful that Draven had not asked her to participate actively yet, sensing correctly that she needed time to learn the shape of this new world before she tried to speak within it. When the meeting finally ended and the council members filed out, the younger woman who had smiled at Lyra lingered behind, approaching with an easy, open expression that felt like the first genuinely warm welcome Lyra had received in the chamber. "I'm Claire," she said, extending a hand. "I handle matters concerning the smaller packs, the ones everyone else tends to forget about in favor of the larger territories. Which, for what it's worth, means I've spent plenty of meetings being looked at the way half this room just looked at you." Lyra found herself smiling in return, grateful for the humor. "That's oddly reassuring," she admitted. "It should be," Claire said. "Most of the resistance in there isn't really about you. It's about change, and this court doesn't love change. Give them time. And don't let Edward's stiff face fool you. He's more reasonable than he seems. He just likes making people work to convince him of anything." Draven, who had been speaking quietly with Amelia near the doors, rejoined them in time to catch the end of the conversation. "Claire has an unfortunate habit of being right about people," he said. "It's part of why she's useful to have in that room." "I'll take that as the compliment I'm sure it was meant to be," Claire said dryly, and excused herself with a final nod toward Lyra, leaving them alone in the emptying chamber. Draven turned to Lyra fully once the doors closed, studying her face with the same careful attentiveness she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "That wasn't easy," he said. "I'm sorry for it. I wish I could have given you a warmer welcome than a room full of skeptical advisors." "It wasn't as bad as I feared," Lyra said honestly. "And I understand their concerns, even if I don't love being on the receiving end of them. I'm not who they expected. I understand why that unsettles people who have spent years planning for something else." "You're exactly who I needed," Draven said quietly, and something in the simple certainty of his tone settled warmly in Lyra's chest. "That will matter more than what anyone expected, eventually. It just takes time for people to see it." Over the days that followed, Lyra began to settle into a rhythm within the palace that felt, if not entirely comfortable yet, at least navigable. Amelia took it upon herself to show Lyra around the sprawling palace grounds, pointing out shortcuts through the gardens, and warning her good-naturedly about which staff members gossiped the most. Claire began stopping by in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss small pack matters but really, Lyra suspected, simply to check in and offer company, and Lyra found herself grateful for the growing friendship more than she could easily express. Draven, for his part, made time for her despite the endless demands on his schedule, small pockets of the day carved out deliberately, walks through the gardens in the early evening, quiet dinners, where he asked genuine questions about her life in Blackthorn, and listened, really listened, to her answers, in a way Cale rarely had, even in their closest moments together. She told him about her mother, gone 3 years now, and the small dreams she'd carried quietly through her years in the pack, dreams she'd never voiced aloud because there had never seemed to be space for them. Draven listened to all of it without judgment, occasionally sharing pieces of his own history in turn, the difficult years after his father's death, when he'd taken the crown far younger than expected, the loneliness of leading without anyone he fully trusted at his side. "It's different, having you here," he admitted one evening, as they sat together in the private garden behind his quarters, the sky deepening into soft violet above them. "I didn't realize how much weight I'd been carrying alone, until I had someone to set some of it down with." Lyra reached over and took his hand, an easy, natural gesture that would have felt impossible only weeks earlier with anyone else. "I know that feeling," she said. "I spent a long time believing I had to carry everything myself too. It's strange, learning I don't have to anymore." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, and for the first time since arriving in the Crown territory, Lyra allowed herself to fully believe that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, whatever skepticism and resistance she would need to overcome, she had found something worth fighting to keep. Not just a king, not just a fated bond, but a genuine partnership built on honesty and quiet, steady care, the kind she had spent years hoping for, without ever quite naming it. She had no way of knowing, in that peaceful moment, that word of her arrival had already begun spreading far beyond the Crown territory's borders, or that back in Blackthorn, Serena had begun asking careful, pointed questions about the Omega, who had smiled, instead of wept at a mating ceremony, and vanished the very next morning. The quiet chapter of her new life was only just beginning, and already, storms were gathering at its edges. Serena slammed the door to her private chambers hard enough to rattle the window glass, her earlier composure from the mating ceremony completely gone. 3 weeks had passed since she became Cale's mate, and in that time, the rumors had only grown louder. A traveling merchant had mentioned, almost in passing, that the Alpha King had taken a mate from a minor northern pack, an Omega with no title, no notable family, nothing that should have caught a king's attention at all. At first, Serena had dismissed it as idle gossip, the kind that circulated endlessly through pack territories and rarely amounted to anything true. But then a second traveler mentioned the same thing, and a third, each account adding small details that tightened something cold and suspicious in Serena's chest. An Omega, with dark hair and gray eyes, one had said. From a pack near the northern border, another had added. Vanished from her own territory the very morning after a mating ceremony where she'd been passed over, a third had said, not knowing the significance of the words to the woman listening. Serena knew exactly one Omega who matched that description. Cale found her pacing her chambers when he arrived that evening, summoned by a sharp message demanding his immediate presence. He had grown accustomed, in these early weeks of their bond, to Serena's occasional flares of temper, usually over matters of pack politics or perceived slights from other noble families. He was not prepared for the question she leveled at him the moment he stepped through the door. "Where did Lyra go?" Serena demanded. Cale blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness of it. "What?" "The morning after our ceremony," Serena pressed. "She left the pack. No explanation, no announcement, nothing. Where did she go, Cale?" "I don't know," he said slowly, though even as he spoke the words, an uneasy feeling was beginning to stir in his chest, one he hadn't let himself examine too closely in the weeks since. "She told the beta it was family business. I assumed she went to visit relatives somewhere." Serena's eyes narrowed. "Does she have relatives somewhere?" Cale opened his mouth to answer, and then hesitated, realizing he genuinely didn't know. He had known Lyra most of his life, had grown up alongside her in the pack, and yet in that moment he couldn't recall her ever mentioning distant family, couldn't picture a single relative beyond her mother, who had passed years ago. The realization sat uncomfortably in his stomach. "I don't know," he admitted again, quieter this time. Serena crossed the room to the window, staring out at the darkening sky with an expression Cale couldn't quite read, somewhere between calculation and unease. "There are rumors," she said finally. "Traveling merchants talking about the Alpha King taking a mate, an Omega from a minor pack near the northern border, vanished from her home the morning after being humiliated at a mating ceremony." Cale felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath him. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "Lyra she's ordinary. She's an Omega from a small pack with no connections, no title. Why would the Alpha King ever notice someone like her?" "Because a fated bond does not care about titles," Serena said sharply, turning back to face him. "That's the entire point of them. If it's true, if that Omega is Lyra, then the woman you humiliated in front of the entire pack is about to become the queen of every territory in this land, including ours." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable between them. Cale found himself replaying that final conversation at the edge of the trees. Lyra's calm, unreadable smile, the strange certainty in her voice when she told him she was truly all right. At the time he had chalked it up to wounded pride, a brave face over private heartbreak. Now, with Serena's words settling over him like a slow, creeping cold, he wondered if he had misread everything entirely. "We need to know for certain," Serena said, already moving toward her writing desk, pulling out parchment with quick, decisive movements. "I'll send inquiries. Discreetly. If it's true, we need to prepare, Kale. We cannot afford to be caught unprepared if the Omega you rejected is about to hold power over both our lives." Kale watched her write, his mind still turning over the possibility, with a mixture of disbelief and something else he didn't want to name, something uncomfortably close to shame. He thought of every small moment over the years when Lyra had quietly supported him, celebrated his successes, comforted him after difficult training sessions, always steady, always present, never once asking for anything in return. He thought of how easily he had set her aside when Serena's family connections and political value had presented themselves as the more sensible choice, how little weight he had given to years of genuine affection in favor of calculated advantage. If the rumors were true, if Lyra really had become the Alpha King's fated mate, then the calculation he had made at that mating ceremony might prove to be the single greatest mistake of his life, and not simply for reasons of the heart. Across the room, Serena finished her letter and sealed it with quick, efficient movements, her expression settling into something hard and focused. "Whatever happens," she said, "we handle this together. If she holds a grudge, we'll need every advantage we can gather. And if she doesn't," she added, more quietly, "then we need to understand exactly how much danger we're actually in regardless." Kale said nothing, but the unease in his chest only deepened. He thought of Lyra's face in the moonlight outside the trees, the calm certainty in her voice, the smile that hadn't wavered even once. He had told himself, that night, that her composure meant she was hiding pain the way strong people sometimes did. Now he wondered if it had meant something else entirely. He wondered if she had known something, even then, that he was only now beginning to understand. The letter went out that night, carried by one of Serena's most trusted riders toward the Crown territory, and in Blackthorn Pack, the quiet unease that had settled over Kale and Serena's chambers began, slowly and steadily, to spread outward through the rest of the pack, as the rumors grew too persistent to remain merely rumors any longer. The training yard behind the palace's eastern wing had become Lyra's favorite place in the entire Crown territory, mostly because it was the one space where nobody expected her to already know everything. 6 weeks into her new life, she had settled into a demanding routine designed to prepare her for the formal presentation Draven had promised would come eventually, when the full council of packs would gather to witness their king present his chosen mate. Mornings were spent with Claire, working through the intricate web of pack laws and territorial agreements that governed relationships between the dozens of packs under the Crown's authority. Afternoons belonged to Amelia, who had taken it upon herself, with obvious enthusiasm, to ensure Lyra could defend herself properly, insisting that a future queen should never feel helpless, regardless of how well protected she might be. "You're getting better," Amelia said one afternoon, circling Lyra with the wooden practice blade in her hand, evaluating her stance with a critical eye. "Your instincts are good. You just need to trust them faster instead of hesitating." Lyra wiped sweat from her forehead, breathing hard from the last exchange. "Hesitating feels safer than being wrong," she admitted. "In a real fight, hesitating is how you end up dead," Amelia said bluntly, though not unkindly. "Confidence isn't about being certain you're right. It's about committing fully to your choice, even when you're not sure, because half measures get people hurt." They continued working through the drill, and Lyra found herself slowly internalizing the lesson, not just in the physical sense Amelia intended, but in a broader way that seemed to apply to everything about her new life. She had spent years in Blackthorn hesitating, holding back, making herself smaller and quieter to avoid drawing attention or causing conflict. That instinct didn't disappear overnight, simply because her circumstances had changed, but she was learning, slowly, to push past it. Draven watched the end of that particular training session from the shaded colonnade bordering the yard, arriving quietly enough that neither Lyra nor Amelia noticed him until the session concluded. When Lyra spotted him, cheeks still flushed from exertion, she felt a small flutter of self-consciousness that eased quickly at the warm approval in his expression. "You're improving quickly," he said as she approached, offering her a cloth to wipe the sweat from her face. Amelia says I still hesitate too much, Lyra said, accepting the cloth gratefully. Everyone hesitates at first, Draven said. It would concern me more if you didn't. The people who never hesitate are usually the ones who never learn to recognize real danger in the first place. They walked together toward the gardens as the afternoon began cooling into early evening, a routine that had become as familiar and comforting as anything in Lyra's life. Their conversations during these walks had grown steadily more open over the weeks, each of them sharing pieces of themselves that felt too vulnerable for the more formal settings of council meetings and public appearances. Edward approached me today, Draven mentioned as they walked, his tone carefully neutral in a way that told Lyra there was more beneath the surface of the statement. About what? She asked. About the timing of your formal presentation, he admitted. He believes we're moving too quickly, that the packs need more time to hear about the situation gradually, rather than through a single dramatic announcement. And what do you think? Lyra asked. Draven was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. I think Edward's caution comes from good intentions, even when it frustrates me, he said finally. He's protected this crown through difficult transitions before, and his instincts about pack politics are rarely wrong. But I also think the longer we wait, the more room we give to rumor and speculation, and rumors rarely paint an accurate picture. I'd rather people learn the truth from us directly than from whispers twisted into something unrecognizable by the time they reach the wrong ears. Lyra thought of Blackthorn, of Kale and Serena, of the pack she had left behind without explanation. She hadn't spoken with anyone from her old life since arriving in the Crown territory, had deliberately avoided sending word to Grace despite the guilt that occasionally pricked at her conscience, uncertain how to explain something so enormous through a letter, uncertain if she was ready yet to have that door reopened before she felt fully steady in this new one. If word is already spreading, she said slowly, then perhaps Edward is right to worry about timing, but wrong about the solution. Waiting longer only gives rumors more time to grow. Maybe the answer is choosing the timing ourselves, deliberately, rather than letting either fear or rumor make the choice for us. Draven glanced at her, something like quiet pride flickering across his expression. That's precisely the kind of thinking this court needs more of, he said. You have good instincts for this, Lyra, better than you give yourself credit for. She felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment, genuine and uncomplicated, in a way praise from Kale had rarely felt, always tangled up, as it had been with her own desperate hope for his approval. This felt different, steadier, built on something more solid than desperate longing. That evening, as she prepared for dinner in her private quarters, one of the palace staff arrived with a folded letter, explaining that it had arrived by rider earlier that day, and been held for delivery once Lyra's training session concluded. Lyra recognized Grace's handwriting immediately, and her chest tightened with a mixture of relief and nervousness as she broke the seal. The letter was shorter than she expected, written in Grace's familiar, slightly hurried script. "Where are you?" it began, without preamble. "You disappeared the morning after the ceremony and left me a note that explained nothing. I've been worried sick, Lyra. There are strange rumors moving through the pack now. Whispers about the Alpha King taking a mate from a minor pack near our border. I don't know what to believe, but I know you, and I know that smile you gave everyone at the ceremony wasn't the smile of someone with a broken heart. Please write back. Please tell me you're safe, at the very least, even if you're not ready to tell me everything else yet." Lyra sat with the letter for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything she had left unsaid pressing against her chest. She thought of Draven's words from earlier, about choosing timing deliberately instead of letting fear decide for her, and made a quiet decision. She would write back tonight. Not the full truth yet, perhaps, not everything at once, but enough to ease Grace's worry, enough to begin rebuilding the connection to her old life that she had let go quiet, out of fear rather than necessity. Some doors, she realized, didn't need to stay closed simply because a new one had opened. She could hold both, carefully, if she was brave enough to try. She reached for parchment and began to write, the first honest letter she had sent since leaving Blackthorn behind, unaware that even as she wrote, Serena's inquiry letter was already making its way steadily closer to the Crown territory, carrying questions that would soon demand answers Lyra wasn't yet ready to give. Amelia arrived at Lyra's chambers before sunrise, her expression tight with an urgency that immediately set Lyra's nerves on edge. "We have a situation," Amelia said without preamble, closing the door behind her. "A rider arrived late last night from the Eastern Territories, from Blackthorn's neighboring pack. He was carrying a letter addressed to Draven's council, from Serena, Kale's mate. She's asking direct questions about you, Lyra, about whether the Omega who vanished from her pack the morning after her mating ceremony is the same woman who has become the king's fated mate." Lyra felt her stomach drop, the careful sense of security she had built over the past weeks suddenly feeling far more fragile than she had realized. "How direct are the questions?" she asked, already dressing quickly, pulling on the simple practical clothes she favored for early mornings. "Direct enough that Edward is furious," Amelia said. "He believes this proves his point about moving too slowly, that we've let the situation slip out of our control by not addressing it directly from the start." They found Draven already in the council chamber when they arrived, the letter in question spread across the table before him, his expression unreadable in the particular way Lyra had learned meant he was working through something carefully, rather than reacting impulsively. Edward stood nearby, along with Claire, both watching the king, with the careful attentiveness of advisors, waiting to see which direction he would move. "I'm sorry," Draven said, the moment Lyra entered, before she could speak. "I know you weren't ready for this, for any of it to reach your old pack yet. I wish I could have given you more time." "It's all right," Lyra said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I knew this moment would come eventually. I suppose I'd simply hoped for a little more time to prepare for it." Edward cleared his throat, his tone carefully measured, despite the tension Lyra could sense simmering beneath his composed exterior. "My king, if I may, this confirms exactly what I feared. If Blackthorn already suspects the truth, we no longer have the luxury of a slow, careful reveal. We need to control the narrative now, before speculation spreads further and distorts into something we cannot manage." "What do you propose?" Draven asked. "A formal gathering," Edward said, "sooner than we originally planned. Bring together the alpha pairs from every major pack, including Blackthorn, and present Lyra formally as your intended queen, before rumor does the work for us in far less flattering terms." Lyra felt her pulse quicken at the thought, an entire room full of powerful alphas and their mates, including Kale and Serena, all watching her be formally presented as queen. The prospect was both thrilling and deeply unsettling, and she found herself gripping the edge of the council table slightly harder than necessary as she absorbed it. Claire, who had been quiet until now, spoke up gently. "That's a significant step to take quickly," she said. "Lyra has made real progress, but weeks of preparation aren't the same as being fully ready for something at that scale." "I understand the concern," Draven said, glancing toward Lyra with a question in his eyes that was really an invitation for her to weigh in, rather than a decision already made. "But I also think Edward is right that we're running short on time to control how this story unfolds. Lyra, this is your decision as much as mine. What do you want to do?" The weight of the question settled heavily over the room, everyone's attention turning toward her, waiting. Lyra thought of the training sessions with Amelia, the lessons about commitment over hesitation, about trusting her instincts even when certainty felt impossible. She thought of Kale's face in the moonlight outside the trees, the confusion in his expression when her composure hadn't cracked the way he expected. She thought of Serena's sharp, calculating letter, already suspecting the truth and moving to protect her own position, before all the facts were even confirmed. "I think Edward is right," Lyra said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "If Blackthorn already suspects, waiting longer only gives Serena more time to shape the story to her advantage before we ever have the chance to tell it ourselves. I'd rather stand in that room and speak for myself than let rumors speak for me." Draven studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride flickering across his expression again, the same look she had seen during their conversation in the garden days earlier. "Then we'll begin preparations immediately," he said, turning back to the council. "Edward, arrange the gathering. Give us 3 weeks, no longer. Claire, I want Lyra's preparation intensified, everything she still needs to know before that room. Amelia, security will need to be airtight, particularly given who else will be in attendance." The room shifted into brisk, efficient motion, Edward already moving toward the door to begin drafting the necessary summons, Claire pulling out fresh notes to restructure Lyra's remaining lessons around the new timeline. Amelia lingered a moment longer, catching Lyra's eye with a small, reassuring nod, before following the others out. When the chamber emptied, leaving only Draven and Lyra behind, he crossed the room and took both her hands in his, searching her face carefully. "Are you truly all right with this?" he asked quietly. "I meant what I said. This is your choice as much as mine. If you need more time, I will find a way to buy it, even if it costs us politically." Lyra squeezed his hands gently, drawing strength from the steady warmth of his grip. "I'm afraid," she admitted honestly. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I'd rather walk into that room afraid and prepared than spend the next several months waiting anxiously for rumors to force our hand regardless. And besides," she added, a small, wry smile tugging at her mouth, "I think I'd like to see Cale's face when he realizes what he actually gave up." Draven's answering laugh was quiet but genuine, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "That's fair," he said. "I admit I'm curious about that particular reaction myself." They stood together in the quiet council chamber, hands still joined, and Lyra felt the nervous flutter in her chest, slowly settling into something firmer, something closer to determination. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to prepare herself fully for the moment that would change everything. The moment when the quiet Omega everyone in Blackthorn had overlooked would finally stand before them as exactly who she had always deserved to be recognized as. She had no intention of wasting a single day of that time. The summons arrived in Blackthorn on a rainy afternoon, carried by a rider in crown colors whose grim, formal demeanor told Cale everything he needed to know before he even broke the seal. He read the letter twice, standing alone in his study, while rain streaked down the windows, and each time the words settled with the same heavy certainty. All alpha pairs are required to attend a formal gathering at the Crown Capital 3 weeks from this date, for the presentation of the King's chosen mate. Attendance is mandatory. No exceptions will be granted. There was no explicit mention of Lyra's name anywhere in the letter, but Cale no longer needed one to understand what was coming. Serena's suspicions, confirmed over the past weeks through careful inquiries and increasingly detailed rumors, had solidified into certainty in his own mind days ago. He simply hadn't allowed himself to fully absorb what that certainty would mean until this moment, holding the summons in his hands, the reality of it pressing down on him with unmistakable weight. Serena found him still standing there 20 minutes later, the letter now resting on his desk, his expression distant in a way that immediately put her on alert. "It's confirmed then," she said, more statement than question, having read the summons over his shoulder. "It's confirmed," Cale agreed quietly. Serena crossed her arms, studying him with the same sharp, assessing look she'd worn since the rumors first began circulating. "You've barely spoken in days," she said. "I understand this is difficult, given your history with her, but we need to discuss strategy, Cale. We cannot walk into that gathering unprepared and hope for the best." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying more exhaustion than he usually allowed himself to show in front of her. "I just keep thinking about that night, at the edge of the trees. I asked her if she was all right, and she told me she was better than fine. I thought she was putting on a brave face. I never imagined she meant it that literally." Serena's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained pragmatic. "Whatever you imagined at the time doesn't matter now," she said. "What matters is how we handle the next 3 weeks, and how we present ourselves when we're standing in that room. If she holds resentment toward you, toward us, we need to be prepared for the consequences that could bring, both politically and otherwise. And if she doesn't," she added, "we still need to understand exactly what kind of relationship we're going to need to maintain with the future queen of every pack in this land, including our own." Cale nodded slowly, forcing himself to focus on the practical concerns Serena was raising, rather than the tangle of guilt and disbelief still churning in his own chest. "You're right," he said. "We should speak with the elders, understand the proper protocols for formal crown gatherings. Neither of us has attended one before." Over the following days, Blackthorn's pack fell into a state of tense preparation, the elders drilling Cale and Serena on formal etiquette expected in the Crown Capital, on the delicate diplomatic language required when addressing a king and his chosen mate. Word of the gathering had spread quickly through the pack once the summons arrived, and with it, the rumors about Lyra solidified from speculation into accepted fact. Grace, who had received a second, more detailed letter from Lyra in the days following the first, found herself fielding constant questions from curious pack members eager to know if the stories were true. "She's really the king's mate," Grace confirmed one evening, to a small gathering of pack members in the common hall, unable to keep the pride from her voice, despite her own lingering shock at the revelation. She wrote to me herself. "I'm going to see her at the gathering." The news rippled through the pack with fresh intensity, and Cale, catching fragments of the conversation from across the hall, felt the reality of the situation settle even more heavily into his chest. He thought of all the years he had known Lyra, all the quiet support she had offered, without ever asking for anything in return, and compared it against the calculated choice he had made at the mating ceremony, prioritizing Serena's political value over years of genuine, steady affection. He found himself, in a private moment that evening, seeking out Grace directly, catching her alone near the pack house entrance as she prepared to head home for the night. "Grace," he said, and she turned, her expression cooling noticeably the moment she recognized him. "What do you want, Cale?" she said, not unkindly, but with none of the warmth she might have shown him even a few months earlier. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, choosing his words carefully. "When Lyra wrote to you, did she mention me at all? Does she?" He trailed off, uncertain how to phrase the question that had been eating at him for days. Is she angry? Does she hate me for what happened at the ceremony? Grace studied him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her tone was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "She didn't mention you much at all, actually," she said, "which honestly surprised me more than anger would have. It's like you're barely a chapter in the story she's telling now, Cale. Not the ending, not even really a beginning. Just something that happened once, a long time ago." The words landed harder than any accusation could have, and Cale found himself absorbing them in silence, the full weight of what he had lost settling over him more completely than it had at any point since the rumors first began. He had spent weeks bracing himself for Lyra's anger, for confrontation, for some reckoning he felt he deserved. Grace's words suggested something far more unsettling, that he simply no longer mattered enough to warrant that kind of energy from her at all. "I see," he said quietly. Grace's expression eased slightly, some old fondness for him resurfacing despite everything. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think she's walking into that gathering planning to make a scene or seek revenge. That's simply not who she is, and becoming queen doesn't seem to have changed that about her, from what I can tell in her letters. But I also don't think you should expect the girl who used to look at you like you hung the moon to still be standing there when you arrive. That version of Lyra left Blackthorn behind the same morning she did." She excused herself and walked off into the evening, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts and the growing uncomfortable certainty that whatever he encountered at the Crown gathering in 3 weeks, it would not be the reconciliation or forgiveness some quiet part of him had been hoping for. It would be something else entirely, a reckoning shaped not by anger, but by the simple, devastating fact of having become irrelevant to someone whose devotion he had once taken entirely for granted. He returned to his own quarters that night and found Serena waiting, already deep in preparation notes for the journey ahead, and settled beside her without a word, the weight of Grace's assessment sitting heavily in his chest, as the days counted down toward a gathering he was beginning to dread more with each passing hour. The great hall of the Crown Palace had never looked more imposing than it did on the morning of the gathering, its towering windows filling the space with pale golden light, its rows of seating filled to capacity with alpha pairs from every pack across the territories, their formal robes and ceremonial jewelry creating a sea of color and status beneath the vaulted ceiling. Lyra stood in a private antechamber just off the main hall, her heart pounding steadily, as Claire made final adjustments to the deep blue gown she wore. The same shade as the crown's banners, embroidered along the hem with delicate silver thread that caught the light with every small movement. She had never worn anything so fine in her life, and the unfamiliar weight of the fabric felt, in that moment, like a physical reminder of exactly how much her circumstances had changed. "You look every bit the part," Claire said warmly, stepping back to survey her work with satisfaction. "Nervous?" "Terrified," Lyra admitted, managing a small, wry smile despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Good," Claire said. "That means you understand how much this matters. Just remember everything you've learned. You belong in that room, Lyra. Everyone out there is about to understand that too." Amelia arrived a few minutes later, dressed in formal guard colors rather than her usual practical training gear, and offered Lyra a brief, steadying nod. "Everything's secure," she said. "And for what it's worth, I've watched you grow more capable every single day since you arrived here. Whatever happens out there, you've earned your place in that hall." Finally, Draven himself appeared, dressed in the full ceremonial regalia of the crown, and the sight of him, composed and commanding, steadied something in Lyra's chest, more effectively than any reassurance from her friends had managed. He crossed the room and took her hands gently, studying her with the same careful, attentive warmth she had come to rely on over the past weeks. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "none of it changes what I already know to be true. You are my mate, chosen not by politics or convenience, but by something neither of us controlled and both of us have come to cherish. Nothing that happens in that hall today changes that foundation." Lyra nodded, drawing strength from his steady certainty, and let him lead her toward the great doors as the formal announcement began echoing through the hall beyond, the herald's voice carrying clearly over the assembled crowd. The doors opened, and Lyra walked forward beside Draven, into the full weight of hundreds of watching eyes. The hall fell into a hush the moment she appeared, a ripple of murmurs and shifting movement passing through the crowd, as pack representatives strained to see the king's chosen mate clearly for the first time. Lyra kept her chin level and her steps measured, exactly as she had practiced during countless sessions with Amelia and Claire, refusing to let the overwhelming scale of the room shake her composure. Somewhere in the crowd, she knew, Kael and Serena were watching, though she deliberately kept her eyes forward, focused on the raised dais at the head of the hall. Rather than searching the crowd for their faces, she would find them soon enough. For now, this moment belonged to her and Draven, to the formal presentation they had prepared carefully together, and she refused to let anything distract from that. They reached the dais, and Draven turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily through the hall, with the practiced authority of a king accustomed to commanding attention. "Packs of the Crown territory," he began, "I have called you here today to formally present the woman who has become my fated mate, and who will, in time, stand beside me as queen of these lands. I know rumors have already begun circulating in the weeks since her arrival, and I understand the questions many of you carry regarding her origins and her suitability for this role. I intend to answer those questions honestly, here, today, rather than allow speculation to continue shaping a story that deserves to be told truthfully." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Draven continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled alpha pairs with steady confidence. "Her name is Lyra," he said. "She comes from Blackthorn Pack, a territory many of you may consider minor in the broader scheme of crown politics. She holds no noble title, no inherited land, no political alliance that would have made her an obvious or convenient choice by traditional standards. What she holds instead is a fated bond, recognized the moment I encountered her, and confirmed 100 times over in the weeks since, through her intelligence, her steadiness, and her genuine care for the well-being of these lands, and the people within them." He turned to look at Lyra directly then, his expression softening in a way that felt, even amid the formal grandeur of the moment, deeply personal and sincere. "I do not choose her despite where she comes from," he said. "I choose her because of who she has proven herself to be, regardless of where she began. And I ask this court, and every pack represented within it, to extend her the same respect and consideration you would extend to any queen who has earned her place beside the crown." The hall remained quiet for a long moment following his words, the weight of the declaration settling over the assembled crowd. Then, near the front of the gathering, Edward rose from his seat, and to Lyra's surprise, began to clap, slow and deliberate at first, before others gradually joined him, the applause building steadily through the hall, until it filled the space with genuine, unmistakable approval. Lyra felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the moment, in a way she hadn't fully anticipated despite weeks of preparation. She glanced toward Draven, who offered her a small, private smile amid the applause, and felt, for the first time since arriving in the Crown territory, that she had truly, fully arrived. It was only as the applause began to settle that her gaze finally swept across the crowd and found Kael, seated near the middle rows beside Serena, his face pale with an expression of stunned disbelief that told her everything she needed to know about how completely the reality of the situation had finally settled over him. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and for a moment, neither looked away. The formal reception following the presentation stretched through the afternoon, the great hall, transformed with long tables of food and drink, the earlier tension replaced by a cautious, curious energy as pack representatives began approaching the dais to offer formal greetings to their future queen. Lyra handled the introductions with a composure that surprised even herself, drawing on the weeks of preparation with Claire, remembering names and pack affiliations, offering warm but measured responses to each greeting. Draven stayed close beside her throughout, occasionally leaning in to offer a quiet word of context about a particular representative or family history, his presence steady and reassuring amid the overwhelming parade of new faces. It was well into the reception before Kale and Serena finally approached, and Lyra felt the shift in her own composure the moment she saw them moving through the crowd toward her, though she was careful not to let it show outwardly. Serena reached them first, offering a formal bow that was, Lyra noted, executed with flawless precision, every gesture calculated for maximum political effect. "Your Highness," Serena said, her voice smooth and carefully controlled. "On behalf of Blackthorn Pack, allow me to offer our sincerest congratulations on this remarkable union." "Thank you," Lyra said evenly. "I appreciate you making the journey." Kale stood slightly behind Serena, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of Serena's practiced smoothness, instead sounding genuinely uncertain, in a way that felt almost startling coming from him. "Lyra," he said, then caught himself, correcting quickly. "Forgive me. Your Highness, I hardly know what to say." "There's no need to say anything elaborate," Lyra said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. The words carried none of the bitterness she might once have expected to feel in this exact moment. Kale studied her for a long moment, something conflicted moving behind his eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, quieter now, clearly attempting to speak privately despite the crowd around them. "For the ceremony. For how I handled things. I never meant to hurt you the way that I did." Lyra considered him carefully, this man who had once occupied so much of her heart and her hopes, standing before her now looking smaller and more uncertain than she had ever seen him. She felt no anger rising in response to his words, no bitter satisfaction at seeing him humbled. What she felt instead was a quiet, settled peace, the kind that comes from having genuinely moved past something, rather than simply suppressing the pain of it. "I appreciate the apology, Kale," she said honestly, "but I want you to understand something. I'm not standing here today because I'm trying to prove anything to you, or because some part of me wanted you to regret your choice. I'm standing here because Draven and I found something real together, something that has nothing to do with what happened between us in Blackthorn. That chapter of my life is closed. It closed the moment I chose to walk toward this life, instead of dwelling on what I'd lost." Kale absorbed her words in silence, and Lyra could see the moment they truly landed, the last of whatever hope he might have quietly carried, for some kind of reconciliation, or forgiveness, settling into simple, clear-eyed acceptance instead. "I'm glad," he said finally, and to Lyra's surprise he sounded like he genuinely meant it. "I'm glad you found something real. You deserve that, Lyra. You always did. I was simply too foolish to recognize what I had in front of me until it was gone." Serena, who had been watching the exchange with careful attention, spoke up smoothly, clearly eager to redirect the conversation towards safer, more diplomatic territory. "We hope to build a strong relationship between Blackthorn and the Crown moving forward, Your Highness," she said. "Whatever history exists between you and my mate, I trust it need not interfere with the broader interests of our pack's standing." Lyra turned her attention to Serena, recognizing the calculated pivot for exactly what it was, and found herself, somewhat to her own amusement, feeling no particular animosity toward the other woman either. Serena had made a strategic choice at that mating ceremony, just as Kale had, and whatever personal history existed between them, it belonged firmly to a life Lyra no longer inhabited. Blackthorn's standing with the Crown will be judged the same way every other pack's standing is judged, Lyra said evenly. Through fair conduct, honest dealings, and genuine contribution to the well-being of these territories. I hold no personal grudge that would color that judgment unfairly in either direction. Something in Serena's expression eased slightly at the response, a flicker of genuine relief beneath her careful composure. "That is more than fair," she said. "Thank you, Your Highness." Draven, who had been listening quietly throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his tone carrying a subtle edge of authority beneath its politeness. "I trust," he said, addressing both Kale and Serena directly, That Blackthorn understands the respect owed to my mate extends beyond this conversation, and beyond this hall. Whatever history exists between you, going forward, she is addressed and treated with the same consideration due to any member of this crown's court. Understood, Your Majesty, Cale said quickly, and Serena echoed the sentiment with a formal nod, both of them clearly registering the quiet but unmistakable warning embedded in Draven's carefully measured words. As the pair moved off to continue their circuit of formal greetings elsewhere in the hall, Lyra felt Draven's hand settle gently at the small of her back, a small, private gesture of support amid the continuing crowd. That went better than I expected, he murmured. Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, watching Cale and Serena disappear into the crowd. It did, she agreed. I think I finally understand what it means to be free of something, rather than just pretending to be. Draven's answering smile was warm and genuine, and as the reception continued around them, Lyra felt the last lingering weight of her old life settle fully into the past, leaving her free to focus entirely on the future stretching ahead, uncertain in its details but steady and sure in its foundation. 6 months after the formal presentation, the entire Crown capital had transformed itself for a single day, streets lined with banners in deep blue and silver, flowers woven through every archway, the whole city humming with anticipation for the coronation that would finally, formally crown Lyra as queen. She stood now in the same antechamber where she had prepared for that first daunting presentation, though the nervousness that gripped her this time felt entirely different from the anxiety of that earlier day, softer somehow, tempered by everything she had learned and grown into during the months between. Claire fussed over the final details of her gown, a stunning creation of pale silver silk that caught the light like moonlight on water, while Amelia stood near the door, arms crossed, though the fond, proud smile on her face undercut any attempt at a stern guard's composure. I remember when you could barely hold a practice blade steady, Amelia said, shaking her head slightly. Now look at you. I still can't hold a practice blade as well as you, Lyra said, laughing. Nobody can, Amelia said with a shrug, entirely without false modesty, and the three of them shared a warm laugh that eased the last of Lyra's nerves. The months since the formal presentation had brought their own challenges, moments of difficult negotiation as she settled fully into her role, disagreements within the council that she'd had to learn to navigate with growing confidence, occasional resistance from pack representatives who still needed convincing that a queen without noble birth could serve their interests well. But she had faced each challenge steadily, drawing on the lessons Claire and Amelia had taught her, on Edward's careful, exacting standards that had gradually softened into genuine respect, on Draven's constant, steady partnership through every difficulty. Word had come from Blackthorn periodically throughout those months as well, mostly through Grace's letters, which had grown warmer and more frequent as the distance between their old life and Lyra's new one settled into something comfortable rather than painful. Cale and Serena, Grace reported, had thrown themselves into strengthening Blackthorn's standing with the crown, their conduct scrupulously respectful in every dealing, whether from genuine reformed understanding or simple political caution. Lyra couldn't say for certain, and found she no longer needed to know which. A knock sounded at the antechamber door, and Draven's voice called through it, familiar and warm. "Is she ready?" "Almost," Claire called back, making one final adjustment to the delicate silver circlet resting against Lyra's dark hair. "There. Perfect." Amelia opened the door, and Draven stepped through, dressed in ceremonial regalia even grander than what he'd worn for the earlier presentation, his eyes finding Lyra across the room and going soft with an expression that still, even after all these months, made her breath catch slightly. "You look extraordinary," he said quietly, crossing the room to take her hands. "I feel extraordinary," she admitted, and meant it fully. He studied her for a long moment, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "Do you remember," he said, "that first day, when I found you at the border and told you the truth about what I felt, not knowing how you would respond?" "I remember," she said softly. "I was terrified," he admitted. "Terrified you would think I was mad, or worse, that you would simply walk away, and I would spend the rest of my life knowing I'd found what I was searching for, and let it slip through my fingers out of my own hesitation. But I didn't walk away," Lyra said. "No," he agreed, smiling. "You didn't. You trusted a stranger's word over everything familiar and safe, and walked into a life you couldn't fully have imagined at the time. I don't think I've properly told you, in all these months, how much that courage means to me." Lyra felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, and blinked them back carefully, mindful of the careful work Claire had done with her makeup. "You gave me a reason to be brave," she said. "For most of my life, I made myself small, quiet, easy to overlook, because it felt safer than reaching for what I actually wanted. You looked at me and saw someone worth choosing, fully and completely, without hesitation. That changed something in me I don't think I can fully put into words." The herald's voice sounded from beyond the chamber, announcing that the ceremony was ready to begin, and Draven offered his arm with the same easy formality he had that very first day in the palace courtyard. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. They walked together through the grand doors into the great hall, transformed now with even more grandeur than the earlier presentation. Every pack in the crown territory represented, including a delegation from Blackthorn seated with quiet, respectful dignity near the front of the assembled crowd. The hall fell silent as they processed toward the dais, and Lyra felt the weight of hundreds of watching eyes settle over her, no longer with the anxious uncertainty of that first presentation, but with the steady, grounded confidence of someone who had truly earned her place. Edward himself performed the coronation, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall as he recited the ancient words of the ceremony, placing the formal crown gently atop Lyra's head, as Draven watched with quiet, unmistakable pride. When Edward finally stepped back and turned to address the crowd, declaring Lyra formally crowned Queen of the Crown Territory and all its packs, the hall erupted into genuine, thunderous applause, far louder and more heartfelt than the cautious approval of that earlier presentation. Lyra stood beside Draven at the front of the hall, the weight of the crown settling comfortably against her hair, and let herself fully absorb the moment, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a quiet smile, at a mating ceremony where she had been discarded and overlooked. She thought of the girl she had been in Blackthorn, small and careful and hopeful, in ways that had so often gone unrewarded, and felt a deep, settled gratitude toward that version of herself, for having the quiet strength to hold on until something better arrived. As the applause continued rolling through the hall, Draven leaned close, his voice pitched just for her amid the noise. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," he said. Lyra turned to him, her smile brilliant and entirely genuine, carrying none of the guarded uncertainty of that first calm smile she had offered at Kale's mating ceremony so many months ago. This smile held nothing back. "I already am home," she said. "I have been since the moment you found me." The hall around them continued to celebrate, banners waving, music beginning to swell from the musicians gathered near the far wall. But for that single, quiet moment, standing crowned and radiant beside the king who had chosen her fully and completely from the very start, Lyra felt only the deep, unshakable certainty that every difficult step of her journey had led her exactly where she was always meant to be.